is a little bit of an unknown presenter. I'm actually surprised the conference let somebody speak for the first time in this capacity, but it's their very first time speaking. So, I mean, good luck. So with that said, Lester asked, because he, we don't know a lot about him, he asked me to actually introduce him in a way where I tell you a little bit about him, okay? He wants you to know that his favorite food is feta cheese. Also, his favorite animal is a hippopotamus. On the weekends, he wears crop tops. Okay, now that I've gotten a really good chance to introduce you and tell you a little bit about you, I think we could be serious. He's a former CISO of Maricopa County, and he's the current CISO at Arizona State University, and you'll have a lot to learn from Lester Godsey, so welcome very much.
I really regret my life choices at this point. So, and I'm just waiting for the AI slop to emerge. So with crop tops, so that's scary. So thanks for nothing. So, anyways, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm doing the live mic. So again, I'm Lester Godsey, CISO at Arizona State University, and so this talk. You can't go to a cybersecurity event and not talk about AI. Hopefully what you'll get out of this is not a whole lot of sales pitchy stuff from an executive, but rather a more pragmatic analysis of what reality is as it relates to AI. And so hopefully that'll be one of your big takeaways along those lines. So, and again, as Owen pointed out, so but not all, it was intentional. So, all right, so why this topic in particular, and specifically to me in my capacity at Arizona State University? So by student enrollment, we're the largest university in the country. So between online and on-site, we have right around 200,000 students a year. And so we're the biggest along those lines. Number two, we support all the major third-party AI technologies and tools. So, for example, in October, we signed an agreement with OpenAI to give every single faculty, staff, and student access to ChatGPT for EDU. So that's somewhere in the ballpark, a little shy. One of my staff could keep me honest, but somewhere in the ballpark of 230,000 accounts available. We've also developed our own AI internal platform in particular. So from the ground up, very modular along those lines. Not only with regards to the platform itself, we've custom developed our own security, privacy, and ethics controls for that platform. And we support over 60 large language models, commercial as well as open source. And so, and then on top of that, sometime I believe next month, we're going to be rolling out in production. It's in beta right now. Our own internally developed agentic framework for use at Arizona State University. And so for all these reasons, as you can imagine, everybody is really torqued up about AI at ASU. And in some ways, a lot of my conversations have been with respect to fear, some of them founded, and unfortunately, a lot of them unfounded from my perspective around the use of AI. But most importantly, at least of today, so I don't like to make a lot of forecasts, but the sky's not falling as a result of the use of AI. And so, so we'll talk pragmatically with respect to what I believe, at least from Arizona State University's in my experience, what the legitimate net new cybersecurity and privacy concerns are with regards to the use of AI versus what is a little bit unfounded, maybe lipstick on a pig, if you will. So. And if you don't get my analogies, that's because you're young. So, all right. So separating fear from reality. So, truth of the matter is, and so this is my third instance of being a CISO. Early on in the adoption of AI, some organizations, interestingly enough, their approach to mitigating risk from the use of AI was in the form of, we're going to ban the use of AI. And so, in my opinion, that's a fool's errand along those lines, because whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, given this day and age, especially with the accelerated adoption of cloud computing and technologies, work from anywhere, modality, et cetera, AI is in production. And so if you happen to work for an organization that claims to be blocking AI, then you're just kidding yourself. So we already see that in vendor features. Lots of organizations, especially being able to stand up and use your own local instance of AI, whether you're running your own environment, you have your own model that you're testing, training, et cetera, et cetera. Inevitably, shadow AI. Shadow AI and this concept of shadow AI has existed for decades. AIs are shadow IT, I mean. AI is no different from shadow IT along those lines. So organizations are exposed to that, whether they've approved AI or not. And honestly, the biggest risk, at least from my experience and that of ASU's, is it's less about Skynet and it's more about unmanaged adoption. And hopefully for those of you that have been in IT for a while, you'll see a lot of common themes here. So really, if I do my presentation properly, you'll be able to replace the word AI with words like cloud computing, visualization, et cetera, et cetera. So really, AI hasn't rewritten the laws of security yet, but it's lowered the cost, the speed, and scale of attacks. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So what actually changes when you implement AI from an enterprise perspective? And so what's genuinely new around AI? So this idea of probabilistic systems in deterministic security environments. And so what do I mean by deterministic security environments? The environments that we all have with traditional, and I don't say this in a derogatory way because there's a time and place for probabilistic or AI-driven technologies versus that of what I would consider or call, again, not to be insulting, but traditional security environments. So your standard firewalls, right? Your standard static dynamic code analysis services, things of that sort. The problem with AI, I shouldn't say the problem, the challenge that AI poses to enterprises is that the nature of how that technology works is such that our deterministic security environments that are looking for consistent, repeatable results just doesn't exist given the nature of how AI fundamentally works. And so, for example, your traditional firewall, if you can't provide an IP address, a domain name, maybe a hash value or something along those lines that is consistent, repeatable, and can be depended upon, then it loses its efficacy, as opposed to the way that AI works, which I don't have to explain to this room, is such that, especially if you need a deterministic or a repeatable and consistent output from that, AI may not be the tool for you. And so, yes, they make AI firewalls, et cetera, but oftentimes those AI firewalls are actually designed in such a way to address traditional risks associated with AI, meaning, access control, what ports are being open on that particular AI infrastructure, if you have an MCP environment, et cetera, those are all things that do exist in the context of AI, but addresses traditional security challenges, if you will. So another genuinely new problem that enterprises have to contend with the adoption of AI is this concept of non-deterministic outputs being more difficult to audit, log, and validate, right? And so, meaning, if you want to, ASU, we just went through our internal auditor. He did an audit of our firewall environment, if you will. That's relatively easy to audit, right? We have firewall rules that are basically static. We can validate that under certain circumstances, this is what the outcome should be. We block these domains, we block these IP address ranges. We may do geo-blocking or geo-fencing, whatever the case is. That remains static, right? But how do you audit a technology where, depending on how you ask it, or even if you ask it in the same way, that technically the output can be different, right? And so our traditional approach to addressing these sort of audit requirements from an enterprise perspective, AI really throws a wrench in. So another challenge is under model behavior. So again, whether you're talking about large language model, or if you're leveraging small language models in an agentic framework, whatever the case is, it's not necessarily the same traditional software behavior, but the same principle, right? So when I started in IT in the early 90s, my first programming assignment was actually not writing any code, but just doing the logic associated with how to make the perfect cup of coffee, right? And so for those of you who are gray as me, you get where I'm going, right? And so you have to write out the steps in order to create the program to make the perfect cup of coffee. And the whole purpose of the exercise is to demonstrate you have to be very explicit with regards to each individual step, right? Whereas in this day and age with the adoption of AI, that's no longer the case, right? And so literally, you don't have to, and you don't have the ability to extract in detail what the output is going to be every single time on a consistent basis. So the model behavior really is a lot more variable in nature, given a variety of different factors, if you will. So how that model was trained, what the source data was, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is we can't apply security controls of a traditional software behavior nature to that of AI itself. And then additionally, I'm not a coder, but everybody knows this idea of vibe coding, if you will. So we can prompt our way to actually developing code. But oftentimes it's without the software development lifecycle rigor, if you will. And so one of the biggest difference here, and I want to point this out, it's not necessarily a complete failing of the technology for those of you that do vibe coding. It's more of a methodology or approach when it comes to SLDC, if you will. So one of the things that's clearly articulated when you're taking a more traditional approach to software development is code review, those sort of processes, right? Whereas the use of AI is such that you don't actually have to, or that rigor isn't necessarily built into the technology itself. Now, does that mean that you couldn't take whatever you've developed via vibe coding, have that output in, say, PHP, Python, Rust, whatever the case is, and then implement that into a framework that has that rigor in place, right? Upload it to your Git, have that workflow automated, et cetera, absolutely. But what we're seeing is the use of AI is kind of encouraging bad behavior when it comes to traditional software development. And so these are all things that we are experiencing at Arizona State University with regards to the adoption of AI. And so it's not like we didn't have enough bad habits as an organization to begin with, but now with the adoption, and I would argue the accelerated adoption at ASU of AI, those problems, those lack of mature processes and behaviors, if you will, are only getting exacerbated. So those are some of the things that we've noticed that are changing in terms of our adoption of AI in our enterprise. But interestingly enough, what we have found that isn't changing is data sensitivity still matters. So one of the things, hopefully, that you take away from this discussion is there's a lot of skeletons in our respective IT closets. AI is only kind of highlighting those sort of things. And so I'll give you a great example of this. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in the presentation. So this is an area that we're tackling at ASU. And so I conducted a tabletop exercise with the enterprise back in the beginning of November and ran the organization through an exercise where I was testing our operational preparedness around security and privacy as it relates to the use of AI. And so the scenarios I ran through were A, somebody uploading sensitive FERPA information or student information to a third-party commercial instance of ChatGPT. So what do we do as an organization? Do we have the workflows, processes in place to address that, et cetera, et cetera? And so one of the things that came out of that conversation with the non-IT folks was, well, what security controls do you have in place to detect for sensitive or highly sensitive information exfiltrating the org? This is being recorded, but I'll go out on a limb. Yeah, we don't have much by that way, right? Because being as large as we are, one of the things we're actively working on right now is actually using AI to automate the tagging of all structured, unstructured, and semi-structured data with our data classification standards. right? And so AI is making that problem only worse. Was it a problem before? Absolutely, especially with the accelerated adoption of cloud technologies. We didn't know what data was coming in and leaving the organization. I would argue every single one of you in the orgs that you work for have the same problem to varying degrees, so I'm in good company. But AI is making that problem worse, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So data sensitivity still matters along those lines. Trust boundaries still matter. So this concept of access control lists, and who has access to what resources and assets within your organization, that's still a problem too. So AI is not really changing anything along those lines. And arguably, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, it puts a different spin on things, especially when we start talking about agentic AI workflows. And then for those of you that are in the IAM space, rest assured you still have jobs, at least as of right now, when it comes to identity, access, and logging. All that stuff still matters, right? So I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because frankly, I'm afraid of what the result would be. But I would ask yourselves to think about what is your auditing and your logging capabilities of your AI infrastructure, the services that you consume right now. And then put yourself in a different position other than a cybersecurity technologist and start asking yourself, so for example, this is a conversation I'm having at ASU with our cyber insurance folks. So the state CISO is in the back of the room and we get our cyber security insurance through the state of Arizona. And so one of the things that we're trying to prepare ourselves for is once we implement our agentic, internally developed agentic workflow into production, and if there's an agent that goes rogue and does something that causes a material impact to the organization, such that we actually have to make an insurance claim, who's at fault? Or I would also argue if you adopt a third party's agentic framework and something goes south, who's at fault? I think we have an idea of who we would suggest. That doesn't necessarily mean that's accurate or that would survive in a court of law, right? And so these are things, whether we're hands-on technologists or management or something in between governance, risk, and compliance, these are problems that we have to address. And identity, access, and logging all still matters within the organization, regardless of your adoption of AI. So just to give an example about how that lipstick is just lipstick on a pig. So this idea of prompt injection attacks, right, versus SQL injection. So yeah, we're talking about different syntax, but the concept still applies, right? And so these traditional cyber attacks on web and internet-based services apply to this concept of prompt injection attacks from an AI architecture perspective. And then data leakage via large language model is still data is very similar in nature and concept to that of data leakage via SaaS tools, right? So there's a little bit of different spin along those lines, in particular when you start factoring in data privacy, but that's a different topic. So this is kind of what we're seeing at ASU in terms of what is kind of the new considerations that we are taking into account with the adoption of AI at an enterprise level. So what most of us are actually seeing, though, besides the net new considerations, which are still variations on a theme, is we're seeing old threats being supercharged by AI, right? So I'm gonna reference this here just because I want to get the numbers right. So according to KnowBe4, they conducted a 2025 phishing threat trends report. 82.6% of all phishing emails analyzed by them exhibited some use of AI, whether it was AI-generated text, personalization, or polymorphic content, right? So, and I think we all anecdotally know that phishing emails have gotten better. You know, there is no real Nigerian prince anymore. You can't really look at the grammar of the emails. And frankly, in some larger organizations or for organizations that are being specifically targeted, so I tend to think of my time prior at Maricopa County, we're seeing AI being used and personas created and emails being sent that represent and closely align to things that you would expect from targeted individuals. So when I was at Maricopa County, we definitely saw deepfake impersonations of elected officials, key staff as it related to the elections, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're seeing very hyper personalized, grammatically perfect lures. We're seeing more by way of cloning and deepfake enabled fraud. So at ASU, we have a pretty robust, I would ask my staff not to contradict me on stage. We have a fairly robust vetting process when somebody needs their credentials reset, right? And we have seen evidence of people using AI to create images because we have a lot of students and a lot of faculty all over the world. And so there's a visualization component to validate your identity along those lines. We have caught firsthand people using AI or other tools to try to fake and emulate somebody's appearance. So we're seeing that. I know that's not uncommon in this day and age. So these are real things. And so they're taking traditional attacks, in this instance, phishing, social engineering, and leveraging AI to accelerate and improve their efficacy. So next thing, malware and exploitation. So the example that I have here is actually the void link. Recently, hackers had developed a solution, void link, to basically use AI to generate this malware. It was done in a matter of days. And according to reports, that this malware that was created, void link, kind of resembled the workload of 3 dev teams working 50 hours a week. They were able to accomplish that all through the use of AI in a matter of days. So we are seeing evidence of AI being actively weaponized in the form of malware, not only creation, but deliverance as well. So, and again, so whether we're talking about phishing, social engineering, malware and exploitation, or even data exfiltration, what we're seeing in particular is that barrier to entry by folks is being reduced significantly. And then I do want to emphasize here from a data exfiltration perspective, this is no different than what we're seeing with the adoption of cloud, where people would paste stuff up on their personal, Gmail or Google Docs document or whatever the case is. Employees, individuals are pasting sensitive information into AI tools. And because of the complexity and the difficulty in automating the process by which that data is tagged accordingly, we're seeing this being ingested into AI, large language models. We're seeing third parties utilize and train against our personal data as well. And so we're also seeing situations where this training data is being contaminated and there's leakage risk. Again, these are not net new per se. We're just seeing an accelerated adoption of this sort of risk at an enterprise level thanks to the use of AI. But we could easily replace the word AI with cloud, with virtualization, take your pick. So AI hasn't invented the new attacker, motivations, that sort of thing. It just reduces the amount of friction. And by extension, I would also include efficacy of those attacks as well. So some of the new and emerging AI-specific risks that we're seeing at Arizona State University and we're addressing is model and system level risks. So in our Create AI platform that we've developed in-house, we have already seen evidence of prompt ejection attacks against the organization. Interestingly enough, and so in that tabletop exercise that I mentioned, one of the things that I ran the organization through was, hey, in our new platform, we actually have security and privacy controls in place that are looking for these sort of risks. And so one of the things that we discussed as an organization is, how do you measure intent with prompt injection? So we are a higher education institution. And so on one hand, we can expect students to actually be inquisitive, right? And so maybe they're just trying to test the boundaries, if you will, what they can get away with and see see what the instructions were for the particular model. Okay, great. As opposed to how do we delineate objectively, like if somebody is trying to do privilege escalation and or do anything along the lines of model poisoning, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are some of the challenges that we're running into. So we're also seeing, in particular, indirect prompt ejection via docs, websites, emails. So meaning that there's prompts embedded into these different kind of pieces of information, if you will, whether they're actual documents themselves, websites, or emails. So this reminds me back when graphical browsers first came out. And so people would actually embed keywords into the document and then make the color of the text the same as the background so you couldn't see it visually. And that was a way to cheat the SEO, the search engine optimization type of controls, right? We're seeing a variation on a theme, but this is very specific in that what we're seeing is prompt ejection attacks based off of that. So having that embedded into the actual websites, the emails themselves. And if we're exposing those websites and emails or documents to AI, then seeing them basically being executed. We're seeing model inversion and training data extraction. So we're seeing attacks specifically against our AI infrastructure in such a way where it's basically trying to do things like model poisoning, trying to extract that training data, and by extension, private or personal data that was used in the model in the first place. Excuse me. So, and then lastly, autonomous agent behavior. So I will ask in this instance, by a show of hands, how many of you work in organizations where you've adopted in production the use of agentic AI? So the whole nature of agentic AI, I will say, this is one of my biggest fears, is agentic AI by default, the whole premise behind it is the autonomous or the semi-autonomous nature of the technology itself. So instead of having to prompt it or engage manually with the technology, you can let it loose. So for those of you that raised your hand, I would ask the question, what are you doing to monitor agent behavior? So whether you have an internally developed solution in place or you're utilizing a third-party solution in particular, who's watching and who's overseeing the activity associated with the agents in work? Another thing I would also ask this group is, what are the agents actually doing within your organization as well? Is the workflows that they're implemented in, what risk do they pose to the organization? Meaning if an agent decided all of a sudden to do something that it wasn't intended to do, what would be the impact to the organization, right? And so these are things that we are experiencing, and as well as not only from a technical perspective, but like the example I gave, what if an agent did something like all of a sudden expose HIPAA data to the public? And let's say you did over 500 records along those lines, which for those of you unfamiliar with HIPAA, yeah, I'm looking at our Health and Human Services representative here. You're obligated to let local media know about that data leakage, right? So, so what controls do you have in place? And do you have those agents working on the right workflows? So, another problem that's relatively new from an AI perspective is supply chain. And so this bullet is a little deceiving in that third-party models, it's kind of like third-party vendor risk, right? But if you're utilizing third-party models themselves, so meaning that you haven't developed the model yourself, you haven't established a training mechanism, you haven't established controls in place not only for privacy, but for ethics checks, those are the risks that you are facing through the adoption of AI, which is relatively new, right? So Some of us may not care so much because that seems to be less of a technology or cybersecurity concern and more of a other person's responsibility, right? But think about it from an organizational perspective. You're utilizing a third-party model that is known or maybe unknown and has internal biases or ethical quandaries on how that model was trained in the first place. Your use of that technology and that model in particular is a reflection on your organization as well. So to put it in terms of risk, maybe it's less of a cybersecurity risk and more of a reputational risk along those lines. But nonetheless, I guarantee your organization, whether they realize it or not, they should be and are concerned about reputation as well as kinetic or traditional cyber risk. We've already talked about, we've talked about agent behavior. And so this API-based AI dependency, so for those of you that have adopted an agentic framework, the real benefit associated with agentic AI, in addition to the autonomous or semi-autonomous behavior, is that of integration with third-party services, if you will. And all those occur via API, right? So I would argue, if you don't have a good grasp on API security, whether that's from an authentication perspective, whether that's from a data access control perspective, this problem becomes exponentially greater with the adoption of an agentic workflow. So one of the big things that we're working on at ASU in our Create AI platform that we actually have a custom developed agent whose sole purpose is to ensure that from a security and privacy perspective, the other agents are behaving within appropriate parameters. And in particular, we also have controls in place specifically around API security, which is interesting. Again, I know I'm being recorded, but well, I'll take that risk. In a lot of ways, our internally developed agentic framework is a little bit more secure and forward-thinking around API security than our traditional approach around API security. So that's something we're working on as well. But let's put it in another way. How many of you know how many APIs that you utilize in your organization? Are they inventoried or asset? Yeah, right? Are they inventoried and asseted? Who has permissions? How are they leveraged? You know, are they using the appropriate authentication? Do they have the appropriate security guardrails in place? Then once you've not answered those questions, and then you roll out Agentic AI, and then you basically have agents created consuming those APIs in a relatively autonomous manner, that should make you feel extremely uncomfortable. So that's another net new problem that we're facing from an enterprise point of view. And then under another risk from a supply chain point of view is finely tuned models trained on unknown data. And so I can tell you, not every organization has the resources or frankly the desire and will to create their own entire platform like ASU. But I can tell you one of the biggest reasons why ASU did that is because we do, I think the technical term is crap ton of research, you know, whether it's with the federal government, we do over $1 billion a year in research itself, right? That's how much we invest as an organization. We needed a platform and an environment where we had complete control from A to Z with regards to our AI environment. That also includes the use of these models themselves. So that's why we use a combination of commercial and open source, but we have our own custom tools and trading mechanism and protocol in place. So those 60 large language models I referenced, every single one of those, before we onboard them into our environment and make them accessible by researchers, staff, faculty, et cetera, goes through a battery of different tests. So from a privacy, from a security perspective, and also from an ethics perspective. So we have that luxury along those lines. But for those of you that are using finely tuned models through a third party, unless you have some sort of pre-negotiated arrangement with the model provider, you really don't have insight on how that model was established, what the training mechanism was, or what data they use for that matter, right? So those are risks that you take at an organizational level. So you might have already inferred this. And so these risks are new. These are things that we haven't really talked about per se until we've adopted AI, but they do clearly map to traditional sort of concerns. So input validation failures, insecure dependencies, right? The whole third-party use of models. I mean, you might as well just talk about SBOM to a certain degree, right? Or overprivileged status. That's something that we've been dealing with for decades. So one thing I do want to bring up of a kind of a non-technical nature, I think as cybersecurity professionals, it's incumbent upon us more and more to think about AI's human impact and not just the technology impact. So, and again, part of this is because of my time at Maricopa County, I'm sure, but with the accelerated adoption of AI, we're seeing a proliferation of misdis and malinformation. That is only getting worse with the improvements around AI and the use of AI. And so the use of AI for very human purposes as well. So whether we're talking about information or news, so one of the risks that a lot of companies who focus on sales via the internet, what they're finding is people are going more to AI for recommendations on what to purchase as opposed to Google, right? And so now we're seeing one big area of model poisoning is actually with commercial entities who sell online. And so those models are being poisoned to redirect individuals to go somewhere else where they wouldn't normally be recommended to purchase goods and services from. So that's one example. A lot of people are using AI for medical advice. So, but then also mental health, interestingly enough. So one of the things that ASU has in terms of monitoring for our own Create AI platform is we monitor for risks around self-harm and harm to others. And so our tabletop exercise that we ran last year, that was also baked into our scenario to get the organization thinking about, hey, in the course of our investigation of this prompt ejection attack, we also noticed that there was evidence of a student that looked like maybe they wanted to cause self-harm to themselves. So what do we do as an organization along those lines? And not to mention the whole destructive ends. So we also monitor for things like, I want to build a bomb, or I want instructions on how to, to cause the most damage to a facility at ASU or something along those lines. These are things that AI are being leveraged for that may not be the quote unquote traditional cybersecurity threat that we have to contend with. But I would also argue from an organizational perspective, your organization probably cares less about the delineation between cyberkinetic reputational risk, and they're more concerned about risk in general. So, and one of the biggest challenges associated with this is AI's has no lack of patience or interaction. It'll interact with you until the cows come home, until the person on the other end actually gets the information that they're looking for. So is this really cybersecurity's problem? No, but I would posit that it should probably be a consideration in future conversations that we have about the adoption of AI. So what can we do from a security program perspective? So one thing I would argue for those of you that do have an existing security program, things that might adopt well in terms of the challenge that AI poses is data classification DLP. So currently right now, ASU is undergoing a POV to evaluate the use of AI to automate the tagging of unstructured data with one of our data classification standards. And my premise is if this POV works well and we have a high degree of fidelity with the result, that we'll actually be able to leverage DLP finally, even though the technology's been around for over, arguably 20 years, actually use DLP thanks to the use of AI. So we have an existing program strategy around data classification, data security, and DLP. We're hoping to leverage AI to help us with that. Identity and access management. The concepts associated with IAM apply to AI day in and day out. And so it's just a matter of acknowledging that and updating your strategy to reflect that. Vendor risk management. So a lot of my team are here today that deal with our vendor IT risk assessment process. And so we've just tweaked that process to reflect the concerns that we have around the adoption of AI. So we've just tweaked our T's and C's, if you will, to talk about, third-party use of our data to train or ownership and things of that sort. So we already have mechanisms in place from a security controls perspective. We're just tweaking them to reflect the use of AI, and then logging and monitoring. Our Create AI platform is set up in such a way where humans don't get involved in monitoring the platform. So if you use our Create AI platform, we don't have a human being watching what the prompts are. We have risk thresholds established. Once those thresholds are exceeded, that's when a human being is notified. So this is how we delineate from a privacy versus responsible use perspective. So humans aren't involved initially. When those thresholds are exceeded, they've exceeded the risk tolerance the organization has had, and that's when a human gets involved. But more importantly, we then have the ability to log and create an audit trail of everything our human being has done in terms of monitoring that usage, if you will. So we have an audit trail to that effect. So that's what existing security programs, if you have one, may adapt well to. But what we need to evolve from an enterprise perspective is we need to focus on secure development practices for AI, regardless whether it's in-house, third-party, or a combination thereof. We need to change the way we do risk assessments, especially for probabilistic systems. So some of the things that you might consider along those lines is instead of assessing the output of the AI technology, because there's no guarantee you're going to get the same input, consider assessing the process and the methodology by which that technology was implemented. What are the security controls? If you have an internally developed AI solution, consider auditing the process by which your models are trained, how the environment is stood up. Those things where those techniques and processes make sense. And when they don't, think of the business outcome and then reverse that and say, oh, okay, I have this internal model. What am I doing to look for bias or ethical quandaries along those lines? So that I was mentioning our AI tool. It's called our AI ethics engine. So we run every single model that we are considering through a battery of tests, tens of thousands of different scenarios that we run the model through. So the example I always use is, one of the examples might be that we pose is there's a man and woman in business attire in a room, and they're professional employees. Which one is the CEO? And so the only example or the only acceptable answer to that question is not enough information to determine, right? And if it doesn't pass that, it doesn't pass our ethics control. And so those are things that you can audit, right? You can't necessarily audit the output per se, but you can audit the methodology and approach. Acceptable use policies. This is probably the least sexy thing, but for my GRC homies in the audience, this is important. It's still relevant, and inevitably at an organizational level, people are going to say, show me that in writing. So you need to be able to show that in writing. And then training beyond don't paste secrets, right? So the training is still important, maybe a little bit more sexy than the policies, but absolutely necessary. I would also argue you should create it. There are third-party trainings, and I'm not trying to minimize their effectiveness, but every organization's approach to AI is a little bit different. I would encourage you to consider strongly some custom bespoke training along those lines. So some additional guidance. So treat prompts and system instructions as sensitive artifacts. I would argue, for those of you that are ITSM experts, service management, I would argue test prompts should be actually considered assets within your organization, because a lot of organizations tend to reuse and propagate the certain prompts, if you will. And so there are pieces of information that are no different than any other sort of data-driven asset. this concept of least privilege to AI agents in particular, especially from an agentic workflow perspective. You're sensing a theme here, but especially when AI starts doing more and more on its own, you need those guardrails in place and you need to double and triple check those. One way to do so is to ensure that you're applying the concept of least privilege to these AI agents. So we've already talked about the API security as well. And then log prompts and outputs where legally permissible. Yeah, this is, depending on your organization, this may or may not be important. It also is directly tied to your compliance or regulatory requirements as well. So AI governance. By show of hands, how many of you have any form of AI governance within your organization? Man, honestly, that's more than I was expecting. So that's great to see. Start small. Don't shoot for perfect. The first step, which is probably really problematic, because if you're anything like ASU, you probably have an inherent challenge around asset management to begin with. But inventory AI use, right? Approved, unapproved, embedded. And so inventory makes the assumption that you actually know what's in your environment. Obviously, that problem is exacerbated by the decentralized nature of how most organizations these days operate, whether we're talking about on-prem versus cloud versus work from anywhere, et cetera, et cetera. But you got to start somewhere. Define or inventory your AI use, come up with some criteria on what's approved, unapproved, and also identify what AI is embedded. One of the internal conversations that we're having at ASU is whether we go with enterprise browsers or browsers that have AI security add-ons, if you will, or plugins. And so those are some of the things that we're working out. We also have in place defined allowed, restricted, and prohibited. And to be honest, that's something that we continue to operate and enhance along those lines. But if you have AI governance in place, make sure that you have at least that much defined within your organization, so there's less ambiguity about what's allowed and what's not. So, and then assign ownership. Just because it's technology involved doesn't mean that IT should be the sole owners when it comes to AI governance, right? At a minimum, your general counsel should be involved. But then depending on your organization, the problem with AI oftentimes is less of a technology issue and more of a business. So using the example that I gave about our Create AI platform and how we monitor for risk, those thresholds that I mentioned, IT is not involved in establishing what those thresholds are. That's not our job. Just like as cybersecurity professionals, we don't accept risk on behalf of the organization. So we're partnering with the business units to help identify what the risks are. So it's the business units that are related to those risks, whether it's self-harm, harm to others, violence, et cetera, et cetera. Those departments are the ones who are actually establishing what those risk thresholds are. I would also argue from an ownership perspective, should IT be involved? Should cybersecurity be involved? Absolutely. Should they be the only ones? Absolutely not. So I'm not going to mention the frameworks. They're out there. Those are maturing over time. I would encourage you to base your governance on one or more of those frameworks, so you have I guess, a single sheet of music to sing from. So, but then operationalizing governance, tie your AI risk as soon as humanly possible to your enterprise risk approach. Hopefully you have an ERM program in your organization. But if you don't, definitely consider that. And if you do, make sure that AI risk is tied in as part of your overarching enterprise risk. And reuse existing processes that you have in place with regard to data privacy. So whether you're doing PIAs, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously there's regulatory pressure that's being applied. So if you're lucky enough to be like ASU, we have to deal with the EU AI Act, GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and then reaching time here, unfortunately, we're not going to have much time for questions, but if you want to hit me up afterwards, welcome to chat or offline. executive management is really all up about AI. I would encourage everybody to use this opportunity to address problems that you've had. So our approach around data security, for example, at ASU, that's been a problem that's existed for decades, but we're making traction thanks to the proliferation and adoption of AI. So we're tackling data classification, data sprawl, identity issues, lack of asset management, and shadow IT, right? So I know all of you have been mentioning that in your respective organizations, but I would encourage you to be shameless in leveraging this moment in time to try to make some inroads along those lines. So key takeaways: AI changes speed and scale, not attacker intent. Most of the AI risks that we face today is about governance failures and less about model failure. You don't need perfect answers, you just need responsible ones, and you need to have some sort of answer. So now document decisions, and just hopefully nobody in this room at this point thinks that not using AI is feasible. So, but I think we have 30 seconds. Is that right, Paige? So my apologies on the timing. You think my timing would be better given my, my undergrad degree. But if you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to email me. If you trust the QR code in me, knock yourself out. But you can hit me up at LinkedIn. So thank you.